Welcome back. So last time you created your initial Laravel app, and we took a tour of how Laravel's welcome page works. In this lesson, we're going to talk about databases. So if you recall, we're building a simple application to store movies and your reviews of them. So all that data's got to live somewhere, and that's where a database comes in. Alright, so like I mentioned, in this lesson, we're going to be creating a database for your application. So let's start off by opening and starting MAMP. And that'll open up the MAMP start page. And when you installed MAMP, if you recall, one of the things it installed was this database server named MySQL. You can see it right here. MySQL is the software that'll be responsible for running your application's database. But quickly, before we get into that, let's discuss what is a database. A database is essentially an electronic filing cabinet for your application. So say in your office, you have a filing cabinet where you store various documents. So inside that cabinet are different folders for storing different types of documents. You may have one folder, for example, for bills. And inside that folder, you place single documents, or sheets of paper in this case, representing the different bills. That's what a database does for your web application's data. It helps you organize and store all of your data. Alright, so you can see here on the MAMP start page it says MySQL can be administered with phpMyAdmin. So let's open up this phpMyAdmin. And what phpMyAdmin is a tool that lets us visually work with our database. So it's essentially a piece of software that lets us work with our MySQL databases. Let's go ahead and start by clicking Databases here, this Databases tab. And then right here up the top it says Create a Database. So go ahead and enter first Laravel app. That'll be the name of our database for our application, and click Create. Alright, perfect. So you can see over here in this left-hand column, you have a listing of all your databases. These three, Information Schema, MySQL, and Performance Schema, are built in, and they're used for background processing and information. But you can see here that our first Laravel app database just appeared after we created it. So again, this database is like our application's filing cabinet. And the equivalent of folders, file folders in a database are called tables. So you can see this form right now. It says Create Table. So we're going to create one table in our database, and the table is going to be used to store our movies. So we'll name the table Movies, and it's going to have 5 columns. We can click Go to initiate the creation of our table. And here are the 5 columns. It's going to have an ID, which every table in your database always has. That stores, the ID column stores a unique integer identifier for each record in your database. It's going to have a title for the movie title. It's going to have a released on date, a rating, number, and review text. So I'm going to go ahead and fill these out now. So ID is of type integer, and we want it to be unsigned, meaning it can't be negative. We want it to be the primary index. You can just click Go here. And we want to check this AI, which means auto increment. You can see by the rollover. Alright, so what does all that mean? So an ID column in your database table is special. It's automatically incremented by designating this AI right here every time you enter a new record into your table. So a record is the equivalent of a sheet of paper. So it represents one object. So for each movie that we want to store in this movies table, as you'll see in just a minute, we'll add records or rows to the table. But with that said, every time you add a new record, it will have an ID value of 1 greater than the previous record that was inserted. So for the first record we insert, by using these settings, it'll automatically be assigned the ID of 1. The second record will be assigned the ID of 2, the third, 3, and so on. And this primary designates that that's how we can identify each record in the table uniquely. So by the method that I just described, obviously, no two rows or records will ever have the same ID. So we can identify each object that's stored in the table by this ID column value. Again, every table always has an ID column. All right, next, title. We're going to use this type varchar, which means variable length character, or characters. And we'll give it a length of 255. So you use this varchar type to store shorter strings. So we can assume that, we'll be able to fit a title in 255 characters. All right, great, moving on. Next is going to be our release date. So we'll call this column released on, and we'll make it of type date. Next, we're going to have a rating, and that will also be an integer. For simplicity's sake, we'll assume that ratings are done on a, say, 1 through 5 scale. All right, and we're going to also set this unsigned attribute because we should never have a negative rating value. All right, and lastly, review. And that's going to be a text type. And the text type is used to store pieces of text that are longer. So as opposed to the varchar here is used to store shorter pieces of text, your review, and this is, just so you know, this is to store your personal review. Say you were writing up a review for a newspaper, that type of review. So that could be a long piece of text. So we'll store that as a text type. All right, and that's all we need to define. So we can click the Save button down here, and that'll create our table. So you can see now over here, under our first Laravel app database, we now have our movies table. And this structure tab is automatically highlighted, and it just shows the structure of the database, all the different columns we just defined. You can see, by the way, that the ID has the special little icon designating that it's the primary key. All right, again, so as I mentioned, after you create a table, you can insert rows or records into it. And we can do that by clicking the Insert tab up here. So I'm going to go ahead and fill out a few of these, and you should do the same. Fill out these 2 entry forms right here, right now, just with movies that you're a fan of, or you can whatever movies you want, including values for all of the different fields. When you get to the date fields, make sure you use this little icon with the date picker, because the dates need to be in this format that you can see right there. The year dash the month dash the day. All right, so go ahead and do that now, and I'll do the same. All right, so I got my 2 movies in there. I'm just gonna click this Go button down here, and that will insert both my records. You can see that we have to enter values for all 4 of these pieces of information: title, released on, rating, and review. But don't enter values for ID. Again, those will be assigned automatically. Okay, let's click Go. And you can see here we get this message, 2 rows inserted. Perfect. So if we click Browse now, you can see here are the 2 rows I added for 2 of my favorite movies, Happy Gilmore and Almost Famous. All right. The other most powerful aspect of a database is the various ways in which it lets you retrieve your data. To retrieve data from a database, you run commands known as queries. And we can do this manually via this phpMyAdmin tool by writing and running commands in what's called the SQL language. Remember, hence the MySQL name of the database. So let's go ahead and click this SQL tab, and we can do select star from movies. What that says is select all the entries and all the information from the movies table. If we click Go, it shows both our movies. Just a few other things briefly. So you can select individual pieces of information. So if we just wanted title, we can just grab the title. Now you can see it just lists the title. All right, and let's do one more. Let's select movies, or select star, sorry, from movies where, let's say I want to do where released on is less than the 1st of 2000. I think that should get me just Happy Gilmore. And it does. So there you go. So that's just a taste of what you can do with queries. Luckily though, Laravel makes it much easier to write code to communicate with your database. So you don't have to handwrite queries like that to retrieve your information. But at this point, how does our Laravel app know about our database? How can it communicate with it? Well, currently it doesn't know about our database, actually. So let's go tell it about it. Let's hide our browser for a second and open up our application here in Sublime Text. And you're going to want to open this .env file. All right, so this is the information we're interested in. This .env file is a configuration file that stores settings for your application. These highlighted settings are the database connection settings. So it has some defaults in there, but we need to change a few of these. So our DB host is at localhost, but it's assuming we're using the default MySQL port, which in our case isn't the case. We're using the custom MAMP one. If you remember, if we go back to MAMP's preferences and check ports, we can see right here that our MySQL port is 8889. So we need to add at the end of this : 8889. Remember, just like when we're accessing our application, we have to use localhost : 8888 to access Apache. In this case, to access our database, we need to use : 8889. All right, so our database, we just created it. It is called first-laravel-app. So let's change that to that. All right, and our username is root, and our password is root. And I know that just because those are MAMP's defaults. So when you install MAMP, it automatically creates a user by the name of root with a password of root. All right, so our settings are in place. Let's load up our application in our browser. Remember, we need to go to localhost : 8888/movies. Remember, that's the folder that our application is in, /public/. Let's just start off at the welcome page. All right, so we're at the welcome page now. But currently we have no real way of knowing if our database has been successfully connected to our application. So let's go back over here and open the routes file. And let's go ahead and add a new route with some code to test out and make sure our database connection is established successfully. And in fact, we don't need these leading slashes. You only need to use a slash when you're referring to just the home page. So this refers to the URL of welcome. And this is going to refer to, we're going to create a new route that refers to the URL database test. So we'll just use database test. Okay, so you should have code that looks like this. So this defines a new route for this URL, and in fact we can test it right away. It'll just be blank. Okay, there you go. So it's a blank page, but there's no error, so the route was defined properly. And the second thing that's passed into this route get function, remember, when you're calling a function, it's followed by a parentheses and then any of the information that you pass to it. So the first thing we're passing to it is the name of the URL to look for. Then the second thing we're passing is this function without a name, this nameless function. And again, this is where we perform whatever we want to do code-wise. So write the following code, and so enter the following code, which is going to check to make sure our database is connected and print out a message if it is. All right, so a few new things here, just briefly. We created an if statement. An if statement in PHP says that if the code inside of these initial parentheses evaluates to be true, then run all the code inside these curly brackets. Okay, so we're using a built-in Laravel function, this db connection get database name, to check and make sure it can successfully connect to the database and retrieve the name of the database. And if it does so, we're going to use this echo statement, which is the PHP function to print out some text. We're going to print out this message, connected successfully to database, and then join that using this dot. That's how you join two strings together. Join that to this same call as before, because what that call does is retrieves the actual name of the database, assuming you're successfully connected to a database. So if we save that and then go back to our browser and refresh our page, you can see that we get our message, connected successfully to database first Laravel app. And we know it's working because it successfully went through these calls, which requires a real database connection, and it pulled out the name of our database. All right, so your app is now connected to your database, which is great. But how do we actually retrieve data from it? So before we talk about how to retrieve data from your database, let's quickly talk about how data flows through a web application. So we created a database, and inside that database, we created a table to store movies. You can consider each one of those movies that we added to the table as an object, a movie object. And that's exactly how you retrieve data within your application, as objects. And it's those objects that get passed around and used in your application. So as you'll see, we'll retrieve all of those movie objects and use their information to display the movies on a page in your web application. That page is what we're going to be building for the rest of this course. But first things first, we need to get the movie objects out of the database. Laravel uses what's referred to as an MVC design. MVC stands for Model View Controller. And those are the three main components of a Laravel application: models, views, and controllers. Up to now, we've talked about only one part, the views. If you recall, remember, we talked about this welcome view here that's loaded when we go to our welcome URL. Now it's time to talk about the second major component, models. A model is used to represent a single type of object in your application and to retrieve those type of objects from the database. So in this case, our object type is, you guessed it, movies. So we need to create a model in our application to represent and retrieve data from our database for a movie, for movies. You always create one model for every different type of object. In our case, this app that we're creating is only going to have one type of object, a movie. So this model that we're about to create will let us automatically interact with our database table and retrieve our movie objects from it. So to create a new model, we're going to do so in the app folder. And here's another awesome feature of Sublime Text. You can create files from directly within the app. So if you right-click over here on the app folder and select New File, we'll get a new file here, and go to File, Save, and save this. Make sure it's in the app folder. We're all good. And name it capital M movie.php. And then add the following code to it. All right, that's all the code that's required to create a model. And once you create a model, Laravel is smart enough to know that since the model is named movie in our case, that its data is stored in the database table with the plural lowercase name. So Laravel knows that since this model is named movie, just the lowercase plural. And it knows that automatically, and it makes that connection on its own without you having to write any code whatsoever for it to do so, which is pretty incredible. All right, so now we've connected our app to our database, and it presumably knows about our movies table, thanks to this new movie model. But don't take my word for it. Let's go and test all this out. All right, so back in the routes file, let's create a new route that we're going to use for the movies page that we are gearing up to start creating. So we'll associate it with the URL movies. All right, and then inside of this route, let's go ahead and retrieve all of our movies from the database. Well, how do we do that? So it's this easy. Let's create a variable named movies, and we're going to store in it all of the movies which were retrieved by using the name of the model, movie, colon, and then the function name all. And this right here, this very simple piece of code is going to retrieve all of our movie objects from the database and store them in this variable, movies. All right, to confirm that that's actually working, let's go ahead and print out the results that we get from making that call that are stored in movie using this code. All right, so all this code is doing is first echoing, so printing out these HTML pre-tags, and pre-tags in HTML are used to display code in a nice readable format. And then we're using this printr function to print out all the movies data that we just retrieved from the database. So let's save that and go test it out. So back in our browser, if we change this URL to movies, oh, class movie not found. All right, so what's going on here? Well, our route is unaware of our movie class. It doesn't know where movie's located, and movie's located within this app folder. So we need to add app/ in front of it. App \, mind you. So that'll tell it that the movie class that it's looking for is in this app folder. You can see the reason for that is because of this namespace statement. Don't worry about that too much. Just know that when you create models using the method we just did in the app folder, that you reference them using app/ and then the name of the model. So if we save that, go back to our browser and refresh, there you go. Here is a collection of all of the movies in our database. And you can see right off the bat that some of this information looks familiar. So here's the information, for example, with all the fields for my first movie. And if we scroll down, you can see here's the information for my second movie. All right, we're gonna leave off here for now. So in this lesson, you learned all about databases and how to connect your new Laravel app to your database. Next time, you're gonna start putting that data to good use. Stay tuned.